Good evening, everyone. I want to welcome you. Those from off campus, welcome to the University of Alaska Fairbanks. Welcome to this event commemorating the 100th anniversary of the Alaska Legislature, celebrating 100 years of representative government in Alaska. I'm really happy we're hosting this event and really pleased at the number of former legislators who've been able to participate in the event. Several here tonight, a couple more will be joining us tomorrow. And just I'll mention some of them. We've got two former speakers of the House, Representative Terry Gardner, who I served with, and Representative Gail Phillips, both here tonight. Both served as Speaker of the State House of Representatives. Former Representative Sally Smith, current Representative Bill Stoltz, current Representative Jonathan Christ-Tompkins. We'll introduce in a few minutes former Representative Willie Hensley, then former Senator Arla Sturgielewski, Senator Vic Fisher, and Representative Katie Hurley, all here as part of this event. 1913 was a big year. The 16th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution was ratified, which authorized the Congress to impose a federal income tax. The Panama Canal was completed, would open the following year. Woodrow Wilson was inaugurated as President of the United States. And here in Alaska, the first territorial legislature came to meet as residents gathered from all over the territory. The four legislators from Nome traveled for almost 2 months to make it to Juneau for the legislative session. Most of Alaska's resources were still in the control of the federal government. Congress had passed the Organic Act in 1912, creating the territory and the territorial legislature, but there was a lot of work to be done. That legislature was a very productive one. The territorial legislature's first act was to give women the right to vote. 7 years before, women in the states were allowed the same privilege. And I've always been proud of our legislature for making that the very, very first action. But 84 pieces of legislation passed that legislature. Compulsory education for children ages 8 to 16. Mine safety codes, Office of Mine Inspector created, a business tax, regulation of banks and corporations, establishment of the first pioneer home for elderly miners in the city of Sitka, and establishment of a poll tax of $4 for all males under the age of 50. It's a long road to statehood from there. A lot of actions took place, but the creation of the territory was really essential for what just 4 years later, authorized by Congress and accepted by the territorial legislature, was the establishment of an agricultural college and school of mines in College, Alaska. The second legislature adopted the act providing 3.5 square miles for the college, and the territorial legislature later helped fund construction of that college, without which we wouldn't be here today. As a former representative, I've been involved firsthand in state government, watched the legislature in action. Now I get the opportunity as chancellor to try to make sure that the legislature recognizes the importance of what they did in the early part of the previous century. I'm pleased that we have the number of legislators here and that we've got a full house tonight. I want to thank everybody who helped organize the event, and would encourage everyone to attend the sessions tomorrow up at the Geophysical Institute at the LV building. Event tomorrow. The items are listed in the program. And with that, I'd like to introduce the foremost political scientist here at the University of Alaska Fairbanks to introduce our speaker, keynote speaker. Please welcome Jerry McBeth.
Thank you, Brian. I did want to thank the sponsors of the 100th Day a celebration in Fairbanks. The Department of History and Public History and the Department of Political Science and the Department of Northern Studies and the Phi Alpha Theta and Pi Sigma Alpha, two honor societies at the university, brought this all together, but it was mostly Terrence's work. I'm now delighted to have the opportunity to introduce you to Willie Hensley, who is a foremost advocate of native rights in the state of Alaska. I've known Willie for more than 30 years, and I'm delighted that he is coming to speak to us tonight. I wish he were a professor at the university, as he once was back in 1981, when we had a joint position in political science and native studies. Willie entered the political arena of Alaska in the 1960s when he was not only young in spirit but young in age, in his 20s, at the development of the Alaska Native Claims movement, a movement I studied many years ago and am still extremely interested in. The state had been given a land grant under statehood of 103.5 million acres, and the state began acquiring properties that were oil and gas prospects throughout the state. And state land actions prompted a reaction from Native communities. Those Native communities had claims to essentially all of the land of Alaska, and those claims were unsettled. They were unsettled when Alaska became an American possession in 1867. They were unsettled at the time of statehood in 1959. Willie became involved in the process of land claims advocacy as a student at UAF, and when writing a paper for J. Rabinowitz, after whom a downtown courthouse is named, who was a Supreme Court justice in Alaska, and who at the time was teaching the political science department sequence of courses in constitutional law. Willie's paper was on what rights to land have the Alaska Natives, the primary issue where he set out the steps, the circumstances, and the steps that Alaska Natives needed to take in order to conclude a land claims settlement with the United States. And this is the basis of the Native rights movement in the state of Alaska. At a very young age, then, Willie was involved, and from there, his career developed in his home region of the Northwest Arctic. He was present at the creation and one of the most responsible agents for the development of the NANA Regional Corporation, which he later served as director and president. He was present at the creation of MNALIP, the Regional Nonprofit Association in the Northwest Arctic. He was present at the creation of the Alaska Federation of Natives, present at its first meeting in 1966, later becoming an executive director, president, and co-chair of AFN. He served in the Alaska House of Representatives for 2 terms and was a majority leader. He served in the Senate for more than 4 years. And then served in the state government. He has a broad range of service in the Knowles administration as Commissioner of Commerce and Economic Development. His most recent posting was as manager of federal government relations for Alyeska, the pipeline services company. And throughout, he's been a member of virtually every important board and commission in the state of Alaska. Willie is unusual in that his career didn't start with a bang and then bust, as some careers do. His career developed strong and continued to build, and he remains extremely active in Alaska. This is a person who will not retire from the political scene, and I'm thankful, and the state of Alaska ought to be thankful for that as well. Please join me in welcoming Willie Hensley, and there will be time after his remarks for questions. Terrence will be running around with the mic, so please, again, join me in welcoming Willie Hensley to speak to us today on issues concerning Native rights and representative government.
No, that's for me. Yeah.
I just want to make sure that this is loud enough. Is that loud enough?
Yes.
Oh, good. And Gary Stevens has joined us. Gary, I don't know if you, Chancellor, if you got, she's Gary, but Gary Stevens is here. And so thank you, Gary. I'm so glad you made it. Is this loud enough?
Yes, but he needs to get really close to the mic like you are.
Okay. So, Will, you have to be really close to the mic, okay? Just.
I'll eat the damn thing. Okay, thank you. Can you hear me now? All right. Kuya gib siya pai. Uvanga Iggiagruk. Kekektagruk mingurunga. Asin tagirmi. Kuya runga uva ilipsi katirusi mani. University of Alaska mi unopak. Kuyanak. Ariga. Utik mani. Fairbanks man. Did you get all that? No. Okay. Well, in spite of the system's strenuous effort to detach me and others from our languages, I hang on to what little I know from my childhood. And what I said was, thank you very much. I'm Iggiagruk. My name is Iggiagruk. I was named for my grandfather. That means I'm a Iggiagruk person, a little island person from Kotzebue. That's what Kotzebue's name is. Tagirmi Asin. Tagirmi is a saltwater person. And I said it was wonderful to return to Fairbanks again.
So, Will, you're going to have to make more love, more passion.
Really? Oh my God. Okay, really gotcha. Jeez. Okay. Well, Dr. Erlander, Dr. Macbeth, Dr. Cole, students, Arliss, Vic, Brian, Tom, let's see, Terry, I'm sorry if Brian, others, I'm talking about the old timers, not the present timers. Anyway, just wonderful, Gail. Just wonderful to see everybody here, and that's one of the great beauties of Alaska. We're still kind of a small town when it comes to people. I'm really very pleased to have been invited to come and speak. Actually, I've been trying to say no to invitations of this nature. But you know, in the Inupiaq world, you don't even ask a question in which you think the answer might be no, you know. We feel tenderly about the other person's feelings. But I was so shocked to be invited that I couldn't resist saying yes. Because Dr. Macbeth and Dr. Cole and Erland, they know that I don't look at things necessarily the same as the son of a pioneer would. And I appreciate the fact that they invited me, and I celebrate the fact that the university is a perfect place to bring different perspectives and ideas to bear in what has become our mutual homeland. And the Alaska Legislature was only about 30 years old when I was born, and when I first came to Fairbanks in the early 50s, when I was about 10, Fairbanks itself was only about 50 years old. And for someone who was raised out in the dog team world in sod houses and tents, Fairbanks was pretty awesome. And I remember actually taking a ride. It was a dirt road, a choppy dirt road from town to the university. I remember the smell of the trees, you know, when I came through here, because we don't have any trees in Kotzebue. And when I was a child, the center of the universe was Kotzebue, of course. Fairbanks was really the second center of the universe, and then Seattle was the third. We never even heard of Anchorage. in those days, because all the Wien air flights went from here to Nome, Kotzebue, Barrow, and then from all the villages in. And we used to listen to the shortwave radio way out in the country. We had oftentimes had a radio that did work, and when we lived out in the country in our sod house, we'd have a wire going to a pole, and we could get, the reports from the North American Championship sled dog race once in a while. And so we'd be listening to what was happening with some of our racers. We had racers like, these are people that you would never know who they are anymore, but Dan Snyder, Eddie Gallahorn, Wilbur Sampson, racing against the Iggiagruks, our traditional enemies, the Indians. People like Horace Smoke, Holy Smoke they called him, Hugh Byfeld, Jimmy Huntington, Gareth Wright, Raymond Paul, George Adler, people that were famous in that particular era, of the 40s and 50s. And they represented to me a cheery generation of real Alaskans who lived at a time when life was not easy. And it was here to Fairbanks where I came after graduation at George Washington University, where I had the good fortune of taking the course from Judge Rabinowitz. To this very day, I still don't know what he was doing teaching. We didn't have a law school. I came to the conclusion that he was just bored. This is just 7 years after statehood. There's probably no cases up there. Anyway, there was only about 8 or 10 of us in this class. Mike Bradner was one of them. And one of your regents also, it turns out, Kirk Wickersham was also in the class. Kirk became a lawyer as a consequence. And that little paper actually changed my life. And it awakened my own sense of justice and also helped affirm my own identity, actually. Because we didn't understand history, and we didn't understand government. We didn't understand politics. I have become a very firm believer in research as a consequence of that, because if I hadn't had the facts and the history and the law and the regulations, if you're going to stand up in public and say and take a stand on something, you better darn well know what you're talking about. And that little paper helped me understand the subject matter that was absolutely critical at that time in Alaska's history. And I saw an issue that needed to be resolved. I saw that there needed to be justice. And if you have an idea like that, and you write about it, and you see something that is of substance, that is going to have an effect on people, maybe tens of thousands of people, then you can't just sit there. If you have an idea that's going to have an impact on people, you have to get out there and do something about it. And so that's how I became an activist, was because of that little paper. So in my graduate class in Anchorage, and I'm a hustler for my class now. I've learned to market, because unless people know about it, they might not take it. It's called Alaska Policy Frontiers. And I require at least a 20-page paper, which is about the size of the paper I wrote. That changed my life. And in any case, that paper helped me see a picture that I had not seen, and actually most Alaskans at that particular time had not seen either, because they had assumptions about the governmental and political process and the legal process that that had a flaw in the thinking. And of course that elephant in the room was who owned Alaska. And I decided we did. But then, of course, you had to go out and fight for it, of course. I remember I was at, I think, McIntosh Hall one day when I took this graduate course. And our good friend, Senator Greening, had made a comment in the press. I was in the process of writing my paper, and he said something to this effect: well, what we need to do is pay off these natives and get on with the development of this land. I looked at that, and it kind of made my heart pound a little bit. I thought that he was shedding a negative light on what rights we might have. And I was babysitting for a friend of mine who was taking a course in mining, because they had hoped to get the Kennecott copper mine going way back then. It's now 60 years later, still not going. Anyway, so I decided to write a letter to Ernest Greening, challenging what he had said. But there was a little silver lining in that phrase. And I looked at it in a different way. I said to myself, well, he must think we have some rights, because you don't pay anybody off unless they have some rights. And so I wrote this letter, and I thought to myself, well, this is a public issue. It's not just between he and I. And so I sent my letter to the News Miner, the Anchorage Times, the Anchorage Daily News, and the Tundra Times. Everybody printed it, except Bob Atwood. I found out later why. Well, so Senator Greening is a good friend of the great artist and author Claire Fayes, whom I had just met by chance that summer. So she calls this telephone down the hall and says, Willie, Senator Greening has come to town and he wants to talk to you. I thought, oh shit. And well, I kind of swallowed and I said, well, sure, I'll meet with the senator. Of course, I was a little kind of, heart was beating a little bit. So Senator Greening and I, the two of us, met at the Nordale Hotel in one of those rooms. And I knew he was going to dress me down, because he was, I didn't know he was running for office 2 years from then, And so he said, well, Willie, he said, I got your letter. And he said, don't you know that I'm the governor who got civil rights for the natives in the territorial days? Took down the no dogs or natives allowed signs? I'm the guy who talked to the legislator, to the natives to run for office, become legislators. Some of them even ran as Republicans. And then he said on this land issue, he said, I've been trying to get the Secretary of Interior to solve this problem for a long time. And he's not done anything. Well, so I said something like, well, Senator, you did the right thing in getting rid of those nasty signs and getting civil rights for Alaska Natives. I said, you also did the right thing in convincing Alaska Natives to get involved in the process, because, we're affected by the laws too. And I said, on the land, you supported statehood. And that Statehood Act authorized over 100 million acres of our land to be taken. And the Secretary of Interior can't solve the problem. I said, it's a congressional responsibility. And we went our separate ways. As a consequence of that meeting, I decided that, as a wonderful person as he was, a great liberal, I thought I could say that on campus, governor, senator, author, editor, on that point, there was no meeting of the minds. And what I discovered later, of course, was that left-wing Greening and right-wing Bob Atwood, when it came to native claims, were in the same boat. They had convinced themselves we had no rights. So that was, thanks to the University of Alaska Fairbanks, we have a native land claims. Anyway, the University of Alaska Anchorage did offer me, and I accepted, an honorary doctorate. You can call me Dr. Hensley if you want. I got it the same year that the mega author John McPhee got his, Coming Into the Country fame. And capital, what was that section on the capital? What they were looking for. Remember that Arliss? It's another forgotten memory. People don't remember that Arliss and I served on the Capital Site Selection Committee. And we are the creators of Willow. Well, along that score, what I didn't know was that McPhee was this famous author. I had no remote idea about writing anything myself. And so I was just blathering on like I do with all these idiots from outside who don't know nothing about Alaska, just trying to get him some, What I didn't know was that his mind was like a recorder, and everything I said he was sort of absorbing. And then we were flying over, who's the realtor from here who was on the committee? Earl Cook. Yeah, Earl Cook. Well, we had to come and look for a site, this side of the mountains, to please Earl, right? And so we took a helicopter up there around Healy, and shoot, it looked like a moonscape down there. Saw a couple of bears, but then we went over this river. It was called the Bulchitna River, or Creek. And I said, that's a damn good name for the capital, Bulchitna. All right. Okay. Now, when you talk about colonization, people's hearts start beating a little hard. And oftentimes there's some not so nice facts that you have to talk about. And I did a lot of research, and have done a lot of research. And I love reading the Coles' works because they love history as well. And what I've learned about Alaskans is that most of us don't know anything about Alaska, hardly at all. And on the native side or the non-native side. And on the native side, because it has been the government, especially the federal government's responsibility to make sure we didn't know anything about who we were. Their job was to turn us into somebody different. And on the non-native side, history began when Grandpa got here, sort of, or great-grandpa. And then we haven't taught it in the schools until recently, and not doing a very good job of it either. So both histories, the traditional history and the modern history, to me are very fascinating. And I spent a lot of time looking at, I wanted to know the frame of mind or the state of mind of people who were leading in earlier times. And I won't go on ad nauseum about what I learned. And I'll cite just a couple of items just to give you some notion of what the frame of mind or vestiges of the frame of mind would have been in 1912 when the first legislature came, okay? One of the benefits of growing older is that we begin to learn a little bit about the complexities of human life. As a youngster, I didn't know squat about life. I had little bits of information about this, that, or another. But you begin to understand some of the notions that tend to influence you throughout your entire lifetime, whether you understand them or not. And to me, high on that list are opinions and edicts from those who claim to be in touch with powerful spiritual forces. And the other comes from political and governmental leaders whose job it is to get you to pay taxes, go to war, and agree to be regulated. And then there are educators who are paid by the system to reinforce basic ideas that support that system and to train you to think and do tasks that you get paid for, and that enriches the realm. Okay? In the meantime, if you are a member of a minority group or don't have the strength in the society to set the rules, good luck. In the case of we Alaska Natives, our experience only differs in degree from those around the world whose homelands have been taken, cultures essentially dismembered, languages and institutions destroyed, and riches secured for governments over which the indigenous people had little or no control, which is a sad fact of life. It happens around the world. And from the days of the Spanish expansion into the Caribbean and the Americas, and the Russian expansion across the Urals into Siberia, and eventually to Alaska, there's been virtually no variance in the rationale that permitted atrocities against people of the New World. I'll give you just one example here. A historian and conquistador, Gonzalo Valdez, described the Indians thusly, quote, naturally lazy and vicious, melancholic, cowardly, and in general, a lying, shifty people. Now the Pope, in 1493, I won't read the entire, they call it bull. It is called a bull. While granting to Spain all new discoveries in the New World, in reality gave license to the conquistadors to do whatever it took to take control of the people and their lands and resources through the famous requiremento, or requirement in English. This document required the Indians to recognize the king as their master and Christianity as their religion. If they did, they would do well. If they did not, quote, this is a quote from that bull, we shall forcibly enter into your country and shall make war against you in all ways and manners that we can, and shall subject you to the yoke and obedience of the church and their highnesses, church and state. We shall take you and your wives and children and shall make slaves of them, and we shall take away your goods, and we shall do the harm and damage, all the harm and damage that we can, as to vassals who do not obey and refuse to receive their Lord and resist and contradict him, and we protest that the deaths and losses which shall accrue from this are your fault. Okay, that's the mentality about the time of the Caribbean. Now flash forward to Alaska. From 1743 until Shelikoff's arrival in Kodiak in 1784, the early fur hunters spread mayhem across the length and breadth of the Aleutians as they raped, pillaged, and enslaved the Onungan and Sukpiat of Kodiak and the Gulf area in their quest for the soft fur of the sea otter. The formation of the Russian-American Company in 1799 simply provided a more organized way to inflict their will on the people along the Aleutians, Kodiak, and the Gulf. The combination of disease, enslavement, hunger, and killing reduced the population of that area by at least 85% or more. The sea otter population was almost extinguished as well, all the way down to Catalina Island. Now, the United States, disregarding the fact that there were less than 500 Russians, now had I had these facts, had I known something about our history, in 1966, if I had had the time, I would have been a raving radical. So in a way, it was good that I didn't know all that had taken place in Alaska's history. Anyway, there were less than 500 Russians at any one time in Alaska, and more than 30,000 Alaska Natives in Alaska. When the United States bought what the Russians claimed, most of Alaska had not even been visited by the Russians, and certainly could not have claimed to have had sovereignty or control over these vast spaces. And at the time, they didn't even have really control of Sitka. I mean, when the doors shut at night, the Russians were inside the stockade and the Indians were over here. And they had gotten wiped out in Yakutat. At one point there, they had lost their capital there in 1802 and came back with 3 ships and a bunch of cannon, and 2 years later retook it. So, to me, this whole notion of sovereignty was a pretty wimpy one. Okay? Now, the Russians ruled by the taking of hostages of the children of indigenous leaders, a practice they had perfected as they sped across Siberia. They developed a class of mixed bloods, they called Creoles, to help govern. Many of them were educated, sent to Russia, and they forced the native men to serve the Russian-American company, and they killed mercilessly in those early days in particular. Okay? Now in Southeast, the Russians met their match. Their garrison in Yakutat, as I said, had been destroyed, and he had lost Sitka. Now, the reality is, between 1867 and 1924, we had no rights. Alaska Natives literally had no rights until the Indian Citizenship Act was passed that year. And we could not own land in our own homeland. We could not file a mining claim. We could not vote. The canned salmon industry began to encroach on the bountiful streams owned by the clans in Southeast. They began to build their canneries and fish traps. The timber began to be cut. And in the north, the whaling industry was going about destroying the 30,000 or so whales that inhabited the North Pacific, on which the Inupiat depended on. When they couldn't make a profit on the oil, they began to kill walrus for their ivory and took the baleen. But they also began to trade in alcohol because it was very, very profitable. Now, the destruction of Cake and the bombing of the Stikine tribe near Wrangell and the bombing of Angoon in 1882, it showed that the new claimants of Alaska were not going to use any mercy either in extending their control. And they were not impressed with the Tlinkit's notion of justice and dispute settlement, which I think the Russians did. But by the time the federal government provided for the first legislature, gold had been discovered in the Yukon, Juneau, and Nome, and the rush was on, and still no rights of any kind for Alaska Natives. I know these are kind of tender subjects when it comes to religion, when it comes to a heritage of mining, but these are truths, okay? By this time, we had been weakened over the century by diseases brought by ships and miners and traders. While there had been existing diseases, nothing like the smallpox, malaria, measles, influenza, dysentery, whooping cough, and typhoid fever that began to plague our people. Huge percentages of Alaska Natives died off from one end of the territory to the other. In the southeast and the northwest coast, 1/2 to 3/4 of some communities died off. I was actually surprised to realize that between the Tlingit, the Tsimshian, and Haida people, there were about 50,000 people around the time of contact. But the fur traffic from the Columbia fur traders and the visiting ships that stopped off in the Caribbean, bringing malaria and other diseases, that was devastating. Okay. Now, when we talk about the first legislature, we were just down there, this wonderful experience we had in Juneau just a couple weeks ago of meeting in the same Elks Hall that the first legislature met in to give the women the vote. Well, until the 1970s, I couldn't even walk in the Elks Hall because they didn't allow colored people in the Elks. And so I wouldn't have been able to get there in 1912 either, had I been alive. Okay? Anyway, but the beauty of our system is that we evolve. And once the Congress saw fit to make us citizens, our people began to participate in the process. And unfortunately, in the territorial requirement for citizenship was pretty brutal. You had to literally abandon any vestige of your traditional life. You had to get the majority of the teachers to verify that, and you had to have five white people say that you are no longer connected to your tribe. So, anyway, the political activism began when the Alaska Native Brotherhood was created in 1912, the same year. the legislature met. But they really began to move politically when William Paul, who had gotten his law degree, came home and turned the attention of the A&B to politics. And they got into it in a big way, and he became a pariah in Southeast Alaska. You ought to see the nasty newspaper art. I mean, they called him a dictator. But the thing that he did, though, was he began to make alliances with Judge Wickersham to try to make sure that they didn't pass, or I guess they passed the literacy laws. They had to attack them legally in the courts and won. They also won the right to allow children, Indian children, to go to the white schools in Ketchikan. And they also decided to try to fight for their own compensation for the land that was taken in Tongass National Forest. The sad thing about that process was they were working on the old system, and when I studied that system here, I thought that's not fair. They spent 35 years in court, got $7 million, not a square inch of land, and were not compensated for the loss of their salmon streams. Okay? To me, that was a thing that struck in my mind, and I decided in my own mind that there was no way that the old system would have provided justice. And so we had to try legislation, even though the notion at that time was almost impossible. We had no lawyers, no money, and nevertheless, those notions came to me here on campus. Now, in one lifetime, when I was growing up in Kotzebue, we had our own language, our own values. We never thought remotely that this land would ever be taken from us. We were still living in pretty much like we had for thousands of years. I lived in 3 different sod houses by the time I was 10. We had virtually no furniture. We had dirt floors, willows that were stomped to the ground, slept on willows with a caribou skin and a sleeping bag, used blazo boxes for our cupboards. We had a wonderful life if we had our health. We worked hard, you know, and what we didn't know, of course, was that our world was beginning to change very, very rapidly. And we've had to make tremendous adjustments in our own thinking, in our own language, to try to understand, you know, the nature of the new world that was coming upon us. But what I didn't know was actually my own grandfather was trying to prepare himself for the new world. I found letters in Indianapolis that were being auctioned off between 1915 and 1918 that were written by Eskimos from Kotzebue to a pen pal in Indiana by the name of Isabel Reed. And lo and behold, I managed to get my hands on those, and 6 of those letters were written by my grandpa, who I had absolutely no idea what he looked like. There were 2 photographs of him. And those letters are poignant in the sense that they were expressing interest like in World War I. And, you know, they didn't have any media. They had no newspapers. In fact, they barely had anything to write on. And they talked about the reindeer fairs, and they talked about the deaths that were taking place, because it's right about the time of the Great Flu, right? And anyway, so our people had faith in the notion of education, even though the price they were being asked to pay was pretty steep. That is, at the expense of literally our identity. Our language was prohibited. People were punished for it, right up until my day, virtually. And even though we have suffered the taking of lands, the taking of resources, influenzas, not having the right to vote, not having the right to own property, not having widows' pensions. In fact, in my legislative era, I was dealing with some of the vestiges of that old world. I discovered in the statutes that Alaska Natives were precluded from entering the pioneers' homes. it said basically any native receiving aid from the federal government is hereby excluded. So if you got a pension, you know, you couldn't go. Well, I know that the Pioneers Home was set up for miners that maybe had no families and didn't hit it rich up in Nome, had needed a place to go. But in those early days of statehood, we had no elderly facilities. And it was one of the few mechanisms to provide for care for the elderly. And I wanted one for my area. But I had to get rid of that statutory language first, and then finally got on the conference committee on the Pioneers' Homes and managed to get $800,000 for a Pioneers' Home in Kotzebue, where we had no Pioneers. Well, we turned it into an elderly facility for our own people, but under contract to Manila, which worked great. And then the other was, I didn't like confrontation for confrontation's sake. I worked very, very hard, and the system responded. I mean, other legislators responded to our unique needs out there in rural Alaska. But I did discover along the way that the Elks Clubs and other organizations had clauses that precluded colored people from becoming members. And this is like in the 70s when I was in the Senate. And so I came up with a bill that said, well, I don't believe that the state should support organizations that discriminate on the basis of race. And so I came up with a bill. And I'll tell you what, it caused me all kinds of flack from one end of the state to the other, because everybody had an Elks Club or a Moose Club. And they called my bill the No Booze for Bigots bill. In the end, of course, the U.S. Supreme Court took care of the problem, but it was quite an interesting thing. And this is, like I said, in the 70s. So we have evolved as a people, the Alaska Native people as well as the non-Native people. And so to me, statehood did bring self-government to Alaska, including Alaska Natives. But the original thought was, of course, to ignore our claims. And the beauty of our system that it worked, even though, and Fairbanks was one of the hot spots, as you might recall, because the leases had been let in '69, the oil found in '68. Everybody's wildest dream was going to come true. They're all going to get rich. And those damn pesky natives started making their land claims, and it got a little hot with the land freeze. And of course, you remember Wally Hickel got elected in '68 because the Democrats were split between Egan and Wendell Kay. And of course, Wally Hickel was no shrinking violet. You know, he was going to move us out of the way, you know, one way or the other, politically, legally, any which way he could. And of course, we did butt heads. But one thing about Wally was that he was a pragmatist. And of course, that was in '66 when he was elected. And then, of course, in '68, what happened nationally? Richard Nixon got elected. And what happened? He invited Wally to become his Secretary of Interior. The fox was going to guard the chickens, and boy, did we have a problem on our hands. Because our hero was Stuart Udall. He was hated by the non-natives because he supported that land freeze. You know, but in the end, oddly enough, we got more out of the Republicans than the Democrats initially offered, as they were trying to struggle to find out what to do with this problem. And so having Wally Hickel in the cabinet was actually a blessing. And Richard Nixon, who was so reviled by some people, is actually our hero. Because without him supporting that legislation, we wouldn't have got that problem settled. So we do owe him a debt of gratitude. Okay. Now, there are people that we've served with that have served from the bush that nobody remembers. People like, besides William Paul, William Bells, who was president of the First Senate, was an Alaska Native. Frank Peradovich was Speaker of the House. Not too long after statehood, he was from Klawock. We had also people like Andrew Hope Sr., Frank Johnson from Southeast, Frank Degnan from Unalakleet, Frank C. from Hoona, Jake Stalker, who actually preceded me. In fact, when I was running for his seat, I was dating his daughter, Annie. Anyway, Eben Hobson, the founder of the North Slope Borough, John Nusinginia from Barrow, John Curtis from Kotzebue, who ran as a Republican. I can't believe that. And others. Anyway, people who are almost forgotten by history. And then in the more modern era, we had people like Frank Ferguson, a tremendous deal maker. People who never made it to college. You had Al Adams. We shared my grandfather and his grandmother were married, so we were family. A tremendous, capable legislator. And people like Al Kukesh and Johnny Sackett. I mean, to me, Johnny Sackett is a hero. I mean, he was a very able politician and finance committee chair during the time of when the big dollars started rolling in. And these people, got into the act, made their alliances, delivered the goods for the state, not just for the villages. And yeah, we've made great progress. We began to dismantle the notion that the Native people were the responsibility of Uncle Sam when we finally had the wherewithal to begin to spend money to provide those facilities and programs and services that all of us Alaskans were interested in. And that money, it had been the dream of those who were fighting for statehood to unshackle themselves from Seattle, from the canned salmon industry, from the mining corporations outside, the shipping companies that they thought throttled Alaska, tried to throttle statehood. And when I got to Juneau as a 25-year-old, I just met one of the younger ones. They're from Sitka. I was literally straight out of college, I had been at GW just a few months before, and all of a sudden, boom, I was there. It was amazing because we had no staff. We had to work right there at our desk. There was a typing pool somewhere if you wrote your letters out in a longhand. We had no radio communications or anything, no means, no media. In fact, for a legislator, it was a fun job because you didn't have your constituents down your neck. We had no money to come to Juneau in those days, right? Anyway, Egan had to nickel and dime to try to make this state function in those early days of statehood. I mean, he couldn't pay for what little government he had, let alone help the cities and towns and villages. And when I got back from George Washington, and I decided to run while I was here on campus for the State House, I thought, I got one issue, land. I got to tell our people they're about to lose it all, and if I don't win, that's okay, because I got my message. But I won. And it was quite a shock. But when I came back from GW, after 10 years of being in boarding school in Tennessee and going to Washington, D.C. to George Washington, I got my degree in the most useless degree in America. I got it in political science. Sorry. Sorry about that. But for me, I made a living with it, And, but things hadn't changed much. I mean, we're still using Coleman lamps and kerosene lamps, and we had these little ramshackle houses. There was no electricity. We were still shipping our kids to Oregon and Southeast, and I mean, there was, things hadn't changed much. But with that money that came in, the first 900 million, and then thereafter, everybody, how many got rich during the pipeline days? I mean, money was rolling. I mean, the last 35 years, have been a complete anomaly in Alaska's history. I mean, Alaska's a hard place to live, you know? And some people who've just moved here think it's always been that way. But people who are from Fairbanks, I remember coming to Fairbanks and seeing these little flat houses that were about this high off the ground, and people were living in their cave down there because they didn't have money, they didn't have financing, and they had to save their dough to put something up on top. You know, they weren't living much better than we were out in the bush. Anyway, what happened was our people got into the act. Unlike many Indians out in the lower 48 who think if they participate in state politics that they're going to lose their tribal rights somehow. That might hurt them. But we never took that point of view. We got involved. And so as a consequence, we began to build schools. We began to build electricity, through AVEC, working with the federal government, so that people can have more than just, the kids can go do their homework, and people can preserve their food. And with satellite dishes, we began to have communications, and we created the Alaska Education Broadcasting Commission. All of a sudden, our own communities can have a radio station. They could hear what's going on in the rest of the world, in the rest of Alaska. And also we have news coming out of those communities. And we began to have airports, so we can have, people can get to the hospital in emergencies. And the health aid program was just absolutely very basic, almost no training. And now we have people running entire health systems. And the CDQ program came along to provide 65 villages with access to the resources just off their shores. And then we have the regional and village corporations employing tens of thousands of Alaskans of all races. And had we not, we didn't have any support from the chambers of commerce back then. They fought us too. But had they known that Alaska was going to end up with about 200 million acres of parks and refuges, they should have supported us for 100 million acres instead of just 44, in retrospect. So I think it's been that resilient spirit of our people to persevere in this Arctic environment. And we've always placed our hopes on the goodwill and understanding of the pioneers who came and those who came after them. And as I see it, it's now our common homeland. And that we have to work together to make a safe and prosperous home for all of us and our descendants. We came a long way from the first legislature.